Hello and welcome to Social Science Weekly, where we take the most important social science papers and give you just the facts with none of the spin. The paper we're looking at today is called Social Capital 1. Now, this paper was published recently in Nature, and Nature is one of the top 2 general interest journals in all of science. Now, what this paper looks at is the relationship between social networks and economic mobility. Now, what economic mobility means is the tendency for people born into a poor background to move up the economic hierarchy during their lives. Specifically, they looked at how social networks influence economic mobility. So social networks referring to all the social ties that people have with each other, such as friendships, work colleagues, acquaintances, and all of those things. Now, this paper is truly unprecedented in asking this type of question because it has access to a very special social network, which we'll get to in a second. And what they end up showing is that social networks, all of your friendships, acquaintances, and whatnot, do matter for economic mobility, but only in a very specific way. More on that later. So just to say that this paper is the product of a rather large collaboration. There are 22 authors on this paper. I won't list them all, but the main ones are as follows. Now, sorry if my pronunciation isn't great on this. The 4 main authors are Chetty, Matthew O. Jackson, Theresa Kuchler, and Johannes Stroebel. Now, most of the authors on this paper work at some of the top American universities, such as Harvard University, Stanford, and New York University, or NYU. But some of the authors on this paper actually work for a private company. That private company is Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook. And you'll see the significance of Facebook for this paper in a moment. Okay, so let's get stuck in. So why is economic mobility so important, and why should social scientists even care about it? Well, just take the United States, which is the subject of this paper, by the way. As a nation, it prides itself on economic mobility. After all, the ability to be born poor and work your way up through the economic hierarchy using just hard work and talent is the essence of the American dream. Having a dream is one thing, but what actually causes a society to have more economic mobility than another? Over the years, social scientists have looked at a range of different factors. This paper focuses on one of those factors, namely social networks. Now, by this point, we have a fairly good idea from past research that our social networks do play a role in our ability to climb up the economic hierarchy through life. But the research has been limited by a lack of high-quality social network data. I mean, if you think about it, it's actually really hard to measure the social network of a really large economy-sized area like the United States, which contains millions of people that have literally billions of social ties to each other. Up until now, our best attempts have involved measuring small and localized networks that contain of the order of thousands of people rather than millions of people. However, the rise of social media has changed all this. We now regularly make digital imprints of our social networks using platforms like Facebook. This offers a spectacular opportunity to study the social network of a whole country like the United States. Now, obviously, Facebook doesn't just let anybody have access to their users' private social network data. However, they do, from time to time, partner with researchers from universities for the progression of social science. So remember earlier when I said that those authors from Facebook would be significant? Well, this paper is the fruit of one of these collaborations. Which is good news for us because it really is hard to imagine social network data of this quality coming from anywhere besides Facebook. Before I tell you the key findings, it's important to understand the limitations of the data. To ask, what are we actually looking at, and what can this data actually tell us? The first thing to say is that the people in this particular study are what you might call millennials. In other words, they are the generation of people aged between 25 and 44 when this paper was published in 2022. This was a call that the authors of this paper made. The main reason appears to be that millennials just so happen to use Facebook quite a lot. So around 80% of millennials in the United States have Facebook profiles. Now, this is something that's not true for older generations, which you might expect, but perhaps also surprisingly, it's not as true for younger generations who are increasingly using other types of social media besides Facebook. But even when limiting the Facebook social network to just millennials, it contains a massive 72.2 million people. This is a large sample, and it means that the authors can really zoom in geographically. Rather than thinking about social networks for a very broad geographic area like a state, the authors looked at real local communities in the United States. By zooming in on local communities like this, we make the study more realistic, because we are looking at groups of people that may truly interact with each other on a regular basis as they live nearby. But it also gives us more data points for the statistical analysis in this paper. Around 40,000 different communities when we zoom in at the most local level. And the more high quality data points we have, the better this is for the science. Now, like all social science data, this data is not perfect, and it's important to spell out its limitations. The big one is that this study only looks at people from the United States. And I'm afraid not all countries are like the United States. I could probably record videos on all the ways that it's a unique and strange country. But for now, let's just say that you should be somewhat cautious in applying the lessons learnt from the US to your own country. Unless your country is the United States, of course. Another concern you might have is that this paper only looks at millennials. You might ask if this strange generation of people is typical of other generations. And in some ways, they certainly are not. However, the authors do go to some lengths to show that the year in which people are born actually had little bearing on the core results of this paper. So this is probably not something to worry about. Another reasonable concern is whether the digital Facebook social network is a good proxy for the real-life social network. Well, it actually turns out that it is a good proxy for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps chief among these, it turns out that people do tend to actually know their Facebook friends in real life. Well, you may ask, I may know my Facebook friends in real life, but I almost never interact with most of them. Now, the authors have covered this off too by showing that the core results in their paper hold even if you ignore Facebook acquaintances that you don't interact with and only look at close friends. Now, it really has to be said that this paper goes further than most others in addressing data limitations, which means that you can have a lot of confidence in the findings. They do this primarily by measuring the things of interest in the paper in many different ways. So the things of interest include measuring social networks or measuring whether people are rich or poor, things like that. And by collecting all this extra data, essentially what they're showing is that the patterns that they're seeing, namely that social networks are important for economic mobility, are not due to any particular quirk in how they happen to have measured things. Or put into science speak, they show that their analysis is hard to vary. Now, just before we move on to the findings from this paper, just a quick honourable mention for a separate paper. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this paper is that you will notice, as I discuss the findings, that I am totally glossing over how the authors measured economic mobility, which of course, along with social networks, is one of the core concepts in this paper. That is because it is actually the subject of a separate but equally fascinating paper by the same lead author as this one, Raj Chetty. If you're interested in how the authors measured social mobility using years and years of tax return data, you should go and look at that paper. As a matter of fact, I've linked to a video where Raj Chetty actually explains how it was done. All right, so now we know what we're looking at, and we know what we're not looking at. What exactly are the findings that you can take away from this paper? Finding number 1. So I mentioned earlier that social networks only influence economic mobility in a very specific way. And now that specific way is through economic diversity. And what economic diversity means is that there are lots of social ties between people who are rich with people who are poor. And it is in these kinds of economically diverse communities where poor people tend to be more economically mobile. And this leads me directly on to finding number 2, which is that there is actually nothing else you can measure about social networks that has anywhere near the same effect as economic diversity. So this paper looked at the cohesiveness of economic networks, which essentially means how close-knit the community is, and it saw very little effect on economic mobility. It also looked at the public spiritedness of a community. So this is measured as, the number of charities a community has, the number of people that volunteer in a community. And just like social cohesiveness, there was very little effect on economic mobility. So they even looked at other types of diversity in social networks besides economic diversity. They looked at friendships between people who speak different languages. They looked at friendships between old and young people. However, they found that unlike economic diversity, neither had a big effect on economic mobility. The third thing to take away from this paper is that reverse causation is not the main effect. And what this means is that it is indeed economic diversity that leads to economic mobility, not the other way around. Reverse causation is a big concern generally for social scientists, particularly when they're doing studies like this one. That is, they're doing observational studies. After all, what if the highly mobile poor people in the study only made their rich friends after they had already moved up the economic hierarchy? This would be a case of economic mobility causing economic diversity. To get around this problem, the authors chose to only look at the friends people made when they were children. And they found when they did this that the results held firm. Now, this is quite a clever way of ruling out reverse causation because, after all, time only runs in one direction. So there is no way that your wealth as an adult can influence the friendships you made as a child. Finding number 4. The relationship between economic diversity and economic mobility survives a thorough search for the dreaded third factor. We've just seen that social scientists need to be concerned about reverse causation when they're doing observational studies like this one. And another thing they need to be concerned about is the dreaded third factor. Now, what the dreaded third factor is the prospect that there is some more obvious alternative explanation lurking in the background that accounts for the relationship in the paper better. So what the authors did, they actually went to town and they looked at 14 alternative explanations for high economic mobility, looking at how wealthy the community is, how much economic inequality there is, the amount of racial segregation, and a range of other factors that could actually influence economic mobility better than economic diversity. And what they find is that economic diversity remains a strong predictor of economic mobility despite the presence of all of these alternative explanations. Now, the fifth and final finding. Though I just said that the influence of economic diversity did not diminish in the presence of the 14 alternative explanations, it turns out that it's not the only thing that influences economic mobility. So, in addition to economic diversity, the data also shows the importance of growing up with two parents in the house. So in short, communities where two-parent households are the norm also tend to have better economic mobility. All this suggests that maximizing economic mobility in a community involves both social ties between rich and poor people, but also the norm of two-parent households. Okay, so those are the 5 main takeaways. Now it's time to wrap up. So this paper used Facebook social network data to examine in more detail than ever before the relationship between social networks and economic mobility. Now that is the tendency for poor kids to move up economically throughout their lives. The data shows that social networks with very high economic diversity, that is lots of friendships between rich and poor people, those are the social networks that promote economic mobility. Now, social mobility is the essence of the American dream. So this paper is asking, what are the conditions that make the American dream a reality? The answer is that diversity in social networks is important, but of a very specific type that may not immediately spring to mind, and that is lots of social ties between people from rich backgrounds and people from poor backgrounds. Then, when you throw in the norm of two-parent households to boot, you get a community where economic mobility is far more of a reality. So that's it for Social Science Weekly this time. Thanks for tuning in. We will provide links to this paper and all the other resources in the description below. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe. It helps us out and means we can make more of these videos. And to keep up to date with Social Science Weekly, you can get us on all the different social medias. And if there's some social science research that interests you and you want to know what the data actually says, then you can leave your suggestions in the comments below. And that's it for Social Science Weekly, bringing you just the facts, none of the spin, from all of the most important social science.